I arrived at my grandson's birthday party holding a carefully wrapped gift and a smile I had practiced all morning. The house was loud with music, balloons taped to every wall, children running across the floor. Everyone was there, siblings, cousins, neighbors, everyone except my dignity. I had helped raise my son alone. I babysat whenever they needed, paid school fees when they struggled, and never once asked for anything in return. I thought that counted for something. Then the cake came out. Plates were passed. Forks were handed out, and suddenly the serving stopped right in front of me. My daughter-in-law looked at me and said, smiling, "You're already fat enough, you don't need cake." People laughed. My son laughed the loudest. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I smiled, picked up my purse, and left quietly. They thought that was the end of it. They had no idea the next morning would change everything. My name is Rosalind Carter. I am 63 years old, and I still believe family should mean something. When the birthday invitation arrived after weeks of silence, I held it longer than necessary, rereading the details as if they might disappear. My grandson was turning 6, and the party was at my son's house. No handwritten note, no warm message, just a printed card slipped into my mailbox. Still, I smiled. I told myself it was a step forward, proof that I hadn't been forgotten. I imagined laughter, candles, and small hands tearing wrapping paper. I remembered all the times I had shown up without being asked. That invitation felt like hope folded into paper. I had no idea it was actually a warning, quietly announcing that I was invited, but no longer welcomed. I spent hours choosing the perfect gift, walking slowly through the toy store and watching children laugh as they tested plastic dinosaurs and race cars. I picked something educational, something meaningful, because I wanted my grandson to remember me as more than just someone who showed up. At home, I wrapped it carefully, smoothing the paper and tying the ribbon twice so it wouldn't loosen. Then came choosing what to wear. I stood in front of the mirror longer than I should have, wondering which version of myself would cause the least trouble. Not too bright, not too plain, something that said I belonged without demanding attention. I practiced a pleasant smile, the kind that never asks questions. Deep down, I sensed this wasn't just a birthday party, it was a test I hadn't agreed to take. I arrived early, like I always do, holding the gift and a container of homemade cookies no one had asked for. The house was already buzzing with activity, decorations half finished, music playing too loud. I offered to help, reaching for balloons and plates, but my daughter-in-law barely looked at me. She nodded once, then turned away, redirecting others with sharp efficiency. I stood there awkwardly, unsure where to place myself, feeling like furniture that had been moved out of the way. Conversations flowed around me, stopping short when I approached. I told myself not to be sensitive, not to read into things, but the silence was deliberate. I had come early to be useful, to be included. Instead, I was invisible, present only because etiquette demanded it. From the corner of the living room, I watched my daughter-in-law command the space effortlessly. She decided where people sat, who helped, who didn't. Her voice was sweet on the surface but sharp underneath, like sugar coating glass. She corrected people loudly, laughed when they stumbled, and made sure attention stayed on her. When relatives complimented the decorations, she accepted praise without hesitation, as if the entire event existed to highlight her authority. I noticed how she spoke about her house and her rules, subtly reinforcing ownership over everything, including the guest list. Every glance she gave me felt measured, assessing, dismissive. It became clear this wasn't just a party, it was a stage. And I had been placed deliberately in the background. What hurt more than her behavior was my son's. He passed by me several times without stopping, his phone always more interesting than my presence. When I tried to start a conversation, his responses were short, distracted, and almost impatient. This was the same child I had stayed up with through fevers, the same boy whose first apartment deposit I had paid. Now, his body language said I was an inconvenience. He laughed easily with others, especially with his wife, but his smile faded whenever his eyes met mine. It felt intentional, rehearsed even. I realized then that distance doesn't happen overnight. It's taught, reinforced, and eventually accepted. And today, he had chosen his side without saying a word. As more guests arrived, the atmosphere grew louder, and so did the jokes. Little comments floated through the room, wrapped in laughter but aimed like darts. Someone joked about old-fashioned opinions. Another commented on how I still eat like I'm feeding a family of 5. Each remark was followed by quick laughter, just enough to make objecting seem dramatic. I smiled politely, nodding as if I hadn't noticed. That's the trick with disrespect, it hides behind humor so the target looks unreasonable for reacting. I could feel eyes flick toward me, gauging my response. I understood the rules of this game very well. If I protested, I'd be labeled sensitive. If I stayed silent, they'd assume permission. So I stayed quiet, storing every word carefully. The cake table was set up near the center of the room, decorated with bright candles and colorful plates. Children gathered first, bouncing with excitement. Adults lined up behind them, chatting casually. I watched from a few steps away, holding my purse, waiting patiently. The cake was cut neatly, slices placed carefully on plates. One by one, they were handed out. Laughter filled the room. The line moved forward and then slowed. I noticed a pause, a deliberate hesitation, as the server reached the space directly in front of me. Conversations softened. Something shifted in the air. I straightened my posture, still smiling, unaware that this moment had been planned long before the candles were ever lit. The room brightened when the cake appeared, a tall chocolate tower covered in colorful sprinkles and 6 flickering candles. Children cheered, adults lifted their phones, and someone turned the music down. I stood near the table, close enough to smell the frosting, telling myself not to overthink things. Plates were stacked neatly, forks laid out with care. My daughter-in-law took charge, smiling broadly as she cut the first slice and handed it to my grandson. Applause followed. One by one, she passed plates to the children, then to the adults. Laughter bounced off the walls, conversations overlapping. I waited patiently, hands folded, reminding myself that this was about the child, not me. Still, a strange tightness formed in my chest as the line moved forward and the space in front of me remained untouched. The plates kept moving until they didn't. The person serving paused, glanced at my daughter-in-law, then subtly stepped around me as if I weren't there. For a moment, I thought it was a mistake. I smiled, shifting slightly closer, expecting the plate to be handed over. Instead, the next slice went to someone behind me. The room felt suddenly quieter, like the volume had been turned down just enough for tension to creep in. I felt heat rise to my face, confusion mixing with disbelief. I had attended every birthday, every holiday, every last-minute emergency. Yet here I stood, deliberately skipped, surrounded by people pretending not to notice. My smile stiffened as the realization settled in. This wasn't forgetfulness, it was intentional. My daughter-in-law finally looked at me, her smile sharp and deliberate. Loud enough for nearby guests to hear, she said, "You don't need cake, you're already fat enough." The words landed heavily, slicing through the air. A few people laughed nervously, unsure whether it was a joke. I felt every eye shift toward me, waiting for my reaction. My heart pounded, not from embarrassment alone, but from the cruelty delivered so casually. There was no hesitation in her voice, no apology afterward. She enjoyed the moment, the control. I stood frozen, my mind racing, replaying the insult over and over. In that instant, I understood this wasn't about cake. It was about humiliation, public, calculated, and complete. After the comment, the room fell into an uncomfortable stillness. Conversation stalled mid-sentence. Someone cleared their throat. Another guest looked down at their plate, suddenly fascinated by frosting. No one stepped in. No one corrected her. The silence felt heavier than shouting would have. I could sense the discomfort, the quiet agreement to let it pass rather than challenge it. A few guests avoided my eyes entirely, while others glanced at me with pity, quickly looking away. The celebration resumed slowly, but something had cracked beneath the surface. Laughter sounded forced now, hollow. I realized how easily people choose comfort over courage. The moment demanded kindness, or at least neutrality, but instead it was met with silence that spoke volumes. Then my son laughed, not loudly, not cruelly, but enough. He shook his head, smiling as if she had said something harmless. "She's right," he added casually, not even looking at me. That laugh hurt more than the insult itself. This was the child I had protected, supported, and defended all my life. In that moment, he chose approval over loyalty. He didn't hesitate. He didn't pause to consider my feelings. His laughter felt like a door closing quietly but firmly. I understood then that this humiliation wasn't accidental. It was allowed, endorsed. I felt something shift inside me, not anger, not sadness, but clarity. I felt the familiar urge to explain myself, to defend my dignity, to say something sharp enough to reclaim the moment. Instead, I smiled. Not because it didn't hurt, but because I refused to give them the reaction they expected. I nodded once calmly, as if the comment hadn't pierced deeply. My hands were steady as I picked up my purse. That smile was not weakness, it was restraint. I let the humiliation settle quietly, knowing this wasn't the place for confrontation. Every insult, every laugh, every silent witness was being stored carefully. I understood now, reacting would give them power. Silence would give me time. Without saying a word, I turned and walked toward the door. No dramatic exit, no tears. Just the sound of my shoes against the floor as conversation slowly resumed behind me. No one stopped me. No one followed. The door closed softly, sealing the moment. Outside, the air felt cooler, clearer. I sat in my car for a long moment, hands resting on the steering wheel, breathing steadily. The humiliation replayed in my mind, but so did something else, a realization. I had been quiet for a long time. Today proved they mistook that for helplessness. As I drove away, I didn't feel defeated. I felt resolved. The drive home felt longer than usual, the road stretching endlessly ahead while the party noise faded behind me. I didn't turn on the radio. I didn't make a phone call. Silence filled the car, heavy but necessary. Every traffic light gave me time to replay the scene, the skipped plate, the insult, my son's laughter. My hand stayed steady on the steering wheel, even as my chest tightened. I wasn't crying. I wasn't shaking. That surprised me most. Instead, a strange calm settled in, the kind that comes when something finally makes sense. I realized this wasn't an isolated moment. It was a pattern I had ignored for too long. With every mile, humiliation slowly transformed into clarity, and clarity into resolve. At home, I sat at the kitchen table and let memories surface, uninvited but undeniable. Late nights working extra shifts. Empty weekends spent babysitting so they could rest. Emergency transfers sent without questions when bills piled up. I remembered holding my son's hand during his first apartment signing, reassuring him when he doubted himself. I remembered skipping vacations, postponing plans, telling myself family came first. None of it had been done for praise, but respect felt like a fair expectation. As the memories stacked up, a quiet realization formed. I had given consistently, quietly, and without limits. Somewhere along the way, generosity had been mistaken for obligation. That thought lingered heavily, forcing me to confront a truth I had avoided. Support without boundaries teaches people how to take, not how to appreciate. I opened a folder I hadn't touched in months, filled with bank statements and handwritten notes. Numbers stared back at me, transfers labeled temporary help, payments marked just until next month. I traced the totals slowly, surprised by how much I had normalized. Rent assistance, utility bills, school fees, and most recently, the mortgage payments I had quietly covered more than once. Each payment had come with reassurance from my son that it was just for now. Looking at the evidence laid out so plainly, I felt no regret, only awareness. This wasn't generosity anymore, it was dependency. I realized my silence had allowed them to believe my support was guaranteed, unconditional, and endless. Seeing it in black and white shifted something inside me. Numbers don't lie, and neither did the imbalance staring back at me. For the first time, I allowed myself to acknowledge the truth. I wasn't powerless. The realization came quietly, without anger or excitement. I held leverage, not through manipulation, but through reality. Their stability depended on my continued support, whether they admitted it or not. That knowledge didn't make me feel cruel, it made me feel grounded. I hadn't planned this imbalance, but I no longer needed to pretend it didn't exist. Power doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it sits patiently, waiting to be recognized. I understood then that I didn't need to confront them immediately or demand apologies. I only needed to stop pretending I owed them endless help. The shift wasn't dramatic, but it was permanent. My phone buzzed with notifications, photos from the party, group messages filled with laughter and cake emojis. I didn't respond. Silence became my decision, not my weakness. I understood that reacting emotionally would only feed the narrative they had created. Instead, I chose distance. No explanations, no reminders of what I had done for them. I let the silence do the work words couldn't. That choice gave me control over something I hadn't realized I'd lost, my peace. I went to bed early, calmer than I'd been in weeks. Silence, I learned, has weight. It unsettles people who expect access, reassurance, and forgiveness on demand. And for the first time, I was comfortable letting them feel uncertain. The next day, I learned through a relative that my absence had been noticed, but not respected. My daughter-in-law joked about how dramatic I was for leaving early. My son brushed it off, saying I'd get over it like always. They laughed, confident that my silence meant surrender. Hearing that didn't hurt the way it might have before. Instead, it confirmed everything I needed to know. They weren't confused, they weren't concerned. They were comfortable enough to mock, dismiss, and assume. That comfort was built on years of my reliability. And that was when I understood something crucial. Change would shock them not because it was cruel, but because it was unexpected. Late that evening, I glanced at the calendar hanging by the fridge. A date circled in red caught my eye, their mortgage deadline. I remembered the panic in my son's voice the last time he'd called, how quickly confidence turned into desperation. The timing felt almost deliberate, as if life itself was drawing a line. I didn't smile. I didn't celebrate, I simply acknowledged it. Tomorrow the phone will ring. It always did. And when it did, I wouldn't need to raise my voice or explain my feelings. Everything had already been decided in the quiet moments they never noticed. The power shift was complete. The phone rang early the next morning, its sound sharp and insistent against the quiet of my kitchen. I stared at the screen before answering, already knowing who it was. He never called this early unless something was wrong. I let it ring twice more before picking up, my voice calm and neutral. There was no greeting on the other end, no small talk, just hurried breathing and the sound of papers shuffling. The contrast struck me immediately. Yesterday, I was invisible. Today, I was essential again. I listened without reacting, without filling the silence. For the first time, I didn't rush to reassure him. I simply held the phone, aware that this call wasn't about connection or concern. It was about need. And need has a way of revealing the truth people try to hide. His voice cracked as he spoke, words tumbling over each other in a rush. The confidence he carried at the party was gone, replaced by urgency and fear. He explained the situation quickly: missed deadlines, final notices, no extensions left. I could hear panic tightening his chest and hearing how close he was to losing control. Every sentence ended like a question, as if he expected me to interrupt with solutions. I didn't. I listened, quietly absorbing the shift. The same son who laughed at my humiliation now sounded small, uncertain, desperate for reassurance. The imbalance was undeniable. He needed me to stabilize his world, just like before. What he didn't realize was that I was listening differently now, not as a fixer, but as someone finally aware of her worth. Eventually, he slowed down and said the words I had heard so many times before. He asked if I could help just this once, promised it was temporary, and assured me things would change soon. His tone softened, practiced, and familiar, shaped by years of success using it. I recognized every phrase, every pause meant to trigger my instinct to rescue. In the past, I would have agreed before he finished speaking. This time I didn't. I noticed how easily the request came, how naturally he assumed my support was still available. He didn't mention yesterday, didn't acknowledge the insult. The expectation was clear: help first, feelings later, if ever. That realization settled heavily as I remained silent, letting him reveal more than he intended. I stayed quiet, allowing him to talk himself into circles. He filled the silence with explanations, excuses, and reassurances, growing more anxious as I offered nothing in return. Listening without interrupting gave me clarity I had never allowed myself before. I could hear entitlement woven into his desperation, expectation hidden beneath fear. He spoke as if my help was guaranteed, as if my role was fixed and unchanging. I didn't correct him. I didn't challenge him. Silence gave him space to expose how deeply he believed I existed to fix his problems. As he talked, I felt strangely calm. For once, I wasn't reacting emotionally. I was observing, and what I saw was someone who had never considered what would happen if I simply stopped stepping in. After a pause, his tone shifted. Relief crept into his voice as if the outcome had already been decided. He began discussing logistics: how much he needed, when he'd pay it back, where to send the money. It was all assumption, not discussion. He spoke with confidence again, as if my silence meant agreement. That moment clarified everything. He didn't ask because he respected me. He asked because history told him I would comply. The ease with which he moved forward hurt more than the request itself. I realized then that my generosity had trained him to believe consequences were optional. I let him finish, let the assumption settle heavily between us, knowing the silence that followed would feel different than any he'd experienced before. When he finally stopped talking, the silence stretched long and uncomfortable. Seconds passed, then more. I could hear him breathing, waiting for confirmation, growing uneasy. He cleared his throat, said my name softly, checking if I was still there. I was. I simply chose not to fill the space. That silence carried weight. It wasn't confusion or hesitation. It was deliberate. For the first time, he felt uncertainty where certainty used to live. The power dynamic shifted quietly, unmistakably. I imagined him holding the phone tighter, realizing something was wrong. Silence had become my answer before words ever arrived. And in that stillness, I felt grounded, no longer rushing to be understood or appreciated. I finally allowed him to feel what I had felt the day before: unsteady, unseen, unsure. If you think silence was the end of this story, hit like and subscribe, because what I said next changed everything. As I listened to his growing discomfort, I chose my words carefully in my mind, not out of anger but clarity. I didn't need to explain my feelings or recount the humiliation. I didn't need to justify my decision. Everything I wanted to say could be contained in a single moment, a calm response shaped by self-respect rather than emotion. I understood that whatever I said next would redefine our relationship permanently. This wasn't punishment. It was a boundary, long overdue. I took a steady breath, feeling neither rushed nor pressured. The woman on the phone was no longer the one who stayed silent to keep peace. She was someone who finally understood the value of her voice and the power of choosing when to use it. After letting the silence stretch just long enough to unsettle him, she finally spoke. Her voice was steady, calm, almost gentle. There was no anger in it, no bitterness, just certainty. She didn't raise her tone or explain herself. She simply said the three words and stopped. The words weren't dramatic or cruel, but they carried weight because they ended a pattern that had lasted years. On the other end of the line, the air seemed to change. She didn't rush to fill the space afterward. She didn't soften the message. Those three words were not meant to hurt, they were meant to close a door. For the first time, she chose clarity over comfort, self-respect over guilt. And in that moment, everything shifted. There was a long pause before he responded, and when he did, his voice sounded unfamiliar, smaller, uncertain. He asked her to repeat herself as if he hadn't heard correctly. The confidence he carried moments earlier vanished, replaced by confusion and disbelief. He tried to laugh it off, suggesting she was joking or misunderstood the situation. She didn't react, she didn't clarify, she didn't argue. Her silence confirmed that she meant every word. He had never experienced this version of her before, the one who didn't negotiate, didn't explain, didn't bend. The realization unsettled him more than anger ever could. For the first time, he understood that something permanent had changed, and there was no quick fix for it. As the call continued, another voice entered the background, tight, sharp, urgent. The daughter-in-law's panic was unmistakable, her whispers rushed and frantic. She demanded to know what was happening, why the conversation had stopped going their way. Her tone carried fear rather than confidence now. She spoke louder, trying to regain control, asking questions that went unanswered. The shift was visible even through sound alone. The woman who once felt powerful enough to humiliate now sounded exposed, threatened by uncertainty. She tried to intervene, to steer the conversation back, but it was too late. Control had slipped from her hands. And for the first time, she realized that the woman she dismissed had quietly held the leverage all along. She chose not to explain herself. No recounting of the birthday. No reminders of the insult. No emotional speeches. She didn't justify her decision or seek understanding. Her silence wasn't avoidance, it was intentional. She understood that explanations invite debate, and she was done debating her worth. Every unanswered question reinforced the boundary she had drawn. On the other end, they grew more anxious, trying to provoke a response, an opening, anything to negotiate. She gave them nothing. The calm refusal to engage was more powerful than any argument could have been. By saying less, she made it clear that her decision wasn't up for discussion. It simply was, and that clarity left no room for manipulation. With quiet finality, she confirmed that the financial help they depended on would stop, effective immediately. There was no anger in her tone, no threats or warnings, just a statement of fact. The reaction was instant. Panic turned to pleading, then frustration, then disbelief. Promises followed, empty, rushed, desperate. She listened without responding, knowing those words came too late. She had learned that respect offered only when support is threatened isn't respect at all. Ending the support wasn't revenge, it was alignment. Her actions finally matched how she had been treated. She wasn't taking anything away, she was simply stepping back. And in doing so, she reclaimed control of her life and her boundaries. Only after the decision was final did the tone change. Apologies surfaced, awkward and sudden. Compliments followed, forced and uncomfortable. They spoke to her differently now, careful, polite, almost fearful. It was the respect she had waited years for, but it felt hollow. She recognized it immediately for what it was, too late. Respect that appears only after consequences isn't genuine. She didn't argue or point it out, she accepted nothing. The shift confirmed what she already knew. She had never been valued for who she was, only for what she provided. That realization didn't hurt anymore. It strengthened her resolve. She understood that walking away now was not loss, it was liberation. After the call ended, the house was quiet. She sat alone, breathing evenly, feeling something unfamiliar settle in her chest, peace. Not the fragile peace of keeping others happy, but the solid kind that comes from choosing yourself. There was no celebration, no dramatic moment, just calm. She didn't wonder if she had done the right thing. She knew. Walking away didn't mean she stopped loving, it meant she stopped accepting disrespect. From that day forward, her life moved at her pace, guided by her boundaries. She didn't need permission anymore. She didn't need approval. She had said what needed to be said and done what needed to be done. And for the first time in years, she felt free.